Hello, and welcome to the Employee Safety Podcast from Alert Media, where you'll hear advice from experienced safety leaders on how to protect your people and business. I'm Peter Steinfeld. Today, we're joined by Theresa Reynolds, Senior Director of Operational Risk Management at Capital One. With over 25 years at the company, Theresa leads enterprise efforts in business continuity and resilience, helping ensure the organization can withstand and recover from disruptions. Theresa explains how her team leverages an operational resilience framework to strengthen the company's agility and resilience in a rapidly evolving risk landscape. Let's get into it. Hey, Theresa, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's jump right into it. Talk to us about your role at Capital One. What is your team responsible for?
My team establishes the policy and framework that governs business continuity and operational resilience at Capital One. In addition to that, we also provide the oversight of that framework, offering advice to our business lines and executing independent challenge, ensuring they're implementing our expectations appropriately. And, the roles really changed a lot over the years. We used to be very transactional focused, I would say, looking to ensure boxes were checked and activities were done on time. And we really are moving more towards a risk-focused role, looking to find places at Capital One that may be exposed to resilience risk, highlighting trends in performance that may lead to risk, that sort of thing.
What emerging challenges or major initiatives are shaping your team's focus right now?
We are really concentrating on third-party resilience risk right now. It's demanding a lot of time and investment, quite honestly. Managing in-house processes, systems, and people, it's much more within our direct control. But when you are relying on external resources and you've got all the associated supply chain risks that come along with that, you've really got to have a robust management approach to ensure their stability and their reliability. So that's where I'm spending a lot of my time. That's where Capital One is spending a lot of their time and making a lot of investment.
Do you have a particular strategy or philosophy guiding your efforts?
We are really anchoring to the concept of operational resilience. It's a concept that's centered on identifying the most essential things that an organization must deliver, and ensuring the entire value chain that supports those things is resilient. And you can define what is important in lots of ways. It can be financially, it could be compliance to laws and regs. But for operational resilience, we focus on prioritizing the customer needs. And you can really think about it as ensuring you deliver on the promise that you've made to your customer. Once you know what's most important, those most important things you do for your customer, then you can map out all of the dependencies needed to deliver that service. It's things like third parties, internal systems, data, people, your facilities, things like that. Once you understand all of that, then you have to determine what your tolerance for disruption is. And really, I actually think about this more as being a reflection of what your customers can tolerate before they experience irreparable harm. Once you know your tolerance, then you have to assess how resilient your dependencies are. And if your dependencies are not as resilient as your tolerance for disruption, then you have to work on developing strategies to create the resilience that you want. It could be things like onboarding alternate suppliers so that you have a backup should one go down, creating manual workarounds for certain processes in the event that technology goes out. Maybe it's ensuring you have backup facilities available, whatever it is. All of those strategies are designed to keep your services resilient in the face of disruption. So the last step after all of that is really to get into the exercise component. So once you've kind of built the resilience you want in your value chain, you then have to exercise it, because until you pressure test it, so to speak, you don't really know that you're getting the resilience that you want. So that's our philosophy. That's what we're anchoring to right now at Capital One.
That's a great framework. How are you actually applying it there at Capital One?
We are working now to be more declarative about what our essential services are, what are our commitments that we've made to our customers that are most important. And we're in the middle of mapping out the dependencies associated with those services. So a part of that work, we're identifying where we have single points of failure that are critical to the delivery of that essential service. It's really important, we're finding, to have the right transparency around those critical single points of failure. We want to make sure we're making the right risk decisions. Are we accepting the risk of those single points of failure, or are we going to choose to invest and mitigate the risk associated with them? They're not easy decisions. They're not cheap decisions to make. So they really require not just deep thought, but you have to have lots of senior level engagement when you're making those kinds of choices. I would say another concept that's been really interesting in our application of this framework at Capital One has been the notion of end-to-end dependencies. People are really good generally at understanding their immediate set of dependencies, the things that they rely on sort of right in their own backyard, so to speak. But when you start talking about the entire value chain that impacts them, you get this concept of like microservices. So things like customer identification or authentication, things that your process might need to have happen, but aren't directly in your purview. You might not always be aware of those dependencies. Even if you are aware of them, you might not think that those things are your problem to solve for. I think a good example of this is, I would say it's no secret that Capital One has a really aggressive cloud strategy. So a lot of what we do is in the cloud. And as we have been working through this process, some of the questions that have come up is whether people's essential services rely on AWS, as an example. And what has been interesting is that people don't always realize that their dependencies have dependencies that rely on the cloud. And so that has just been a really aha moment for us at Capital One, where people have said, no, I don't have a dependency on the cloud. But the more you dig, the more you realize that you've got these secondary and tertiary dependencies that they didn't realize.
Well, now that you've lived this framework for a while, what are the primary benefits of implementing it across an organization?
One of the main benefits, I think, is just giving an organizing structure that leadership can really rally around, particularly when you're making trade-off decisions with resources. It creates shared clarity, I think, when you're aligning around priorities, especially when you've got different understandings and different definitions of what is critical. And I think there are a lot of organizations out there that probably define criticality in different ways. And so this gives kind of a common definition, a common understanding of what is most important. Everyone can sort of march in the same direction. We have a common understanding of what truly matters to our customer, and that enables more effective resource allocation and decision making. So I think that's one of the biggest benefits of this framework for us.
Can you share an example of when this framework helped drive better decision making or avoid significant disruption?
When you map your essential services, you look at the resilience along the entire value chain. So when you do this, it really becomes easier to see where you have systems that are set to recover quickly and where maybe you have a weaker link. So for example, you might have most of your systems or applications that can recover in 15 minutes, but you might have a third party that can only recover within 4 hours or 6 hours. And you're really only as strong as your weakest link. And so I think this is some of the learnings that we had at Capital One when we started to look at that full value chain. It helped us make better decisions regarding where we wanted to improve resilience, where we wanted to set higher expectations in terms of recovery with some of our third parties. If you have third parties supporting a process that is very important and the majority of the things in that process are set to recover within 15 minutes, you don't want a third party supporting that process to be lagging behind. And so these types of learnings are really helping to drive clearer, better decision making at Capital One.
How does this framework support your team during times of high crisis activity?
We talked earlier about how it helps prioritize. And I think the same holds true during a crisis. It just helps prioritize activity. 2025 started off in a really intense way. It felt like in the first couple of months, we had already lived it an entire year. We had weather events, we had political disruption, party outages. So our crisis team was activating constantly. And the operational resilience framework really helped us understand where we had single points of failure. It shined a light on our most critical services amid all of that chaos. We've had to prioritize work regarding improving resilience of third parties, over 1,000 third parties that Capital One uses. And that can be a really daunting task. So we leveraged our ops risk framework and that operational resilience framework to identify the third parties that are most critical to supporting the business services. We found the ones that are single points of failure. The really nice thing about it is that our leaders were all able to get on the same page. They were all able to agree that this was the set of third parties that were the most important, the ones that we were going to go after to make sure that they were the most resilient, so that in these times of disruption, we felt really good about how these third parties were going to be able to respond for us. And I think we all know it can be really hard to get our leaders to agree on priorities. And we were able to do that through this framework because we had that common organizing structure of being focused on the customer. So that's really how it's helping us in times of crisis.
Well, you mentioned that 2025 got off to kind of a crazy start. So what are some of the challenges you faced in crisis response very recently?
The first word that comes to mind is fatigue. There were a lot of crises going on, which becomes very time consuming and difficult to manage. But another thing that we realized through providing oversight over those crises was we were relying too much on a few people, and we really needed to build up our bench strength. While it maybe seemed efficient at the time, we had created a single point of failure. And, we were so busy trying to manage that across the company. I think we didn't realize we had a single point of failure.
What checks or evaluations are most beneficial when maintaining confidence in your processes?
Yeah, we've got controls, which are activities that you put in place to ensure processes run as intended. We believe it's important to have these controls at critical places along the process. Things like ensuring our crisis plans are updated and approved. That's one example. It's also important to test the controls to be sure they're working the way they're supposed to, ensure they're designed appropriately for the risk they're supposed to manage. So for our team, it's really important, for example, that business continuity plans are in place for processes all across Capital One. The plans help ensure processes can recover or remain resilient in the face of disruption. But it's also important to have controls. They exist to make sure that the plans are created with high quality. So those things sort of work together to form a net of protection, so to speak, to help keep our company safe.
Now, if someone's listening and is part of a small team with limited resources, how can they begin adopting the mindset behind operational resilience?
I think in some ways, this is even more important for small teams. They're certainly resource constrained, and it's more important to know what matters most in those small institutions because you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to do the bare minimum on everything, or you're going to find ways to do meaningful work on a subset of things. So I would say if you can adopt the mindset of focusing on what is most important, that's a really good start. If you can have a way of identifying, those critical things and you can understand what those things depend on, even if it's informally, it doesn't have to be a big program. It doesn't have to be putting a big framework in place, but that can be a tool for prioritization. So no matter what you're trying to do, if you're trying to make things more resilient or if you're trying to do something else, understanding those core sets of services that are most important and the things that they depend on can drive that prioritization that can then help drive risk reduction in some way, even with a small team. So that's what I would focus on.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, what's next for you and your team as you continue to mature your resilience strategy?
For us, it's really about getting into the expression of the tolerance for disruption. So we've got our essential services mostly defined. We've got the dependencies laid out. So we really need to get that tolerance for disruption articulated. And then we're going to be turning to that exercise component. So once we understand how resilient all of those services are, then we need to get into exercising and pressure testing those services, making sure that they are as resilient as we think that they are. And it's funny because it can be really hard to make time for that. It's a lot of work to get to that point. And I think people want to sort of celebrate once you get all of that documentation complete, but we don't really know for sure that our plans work. And so we're really not done until we can test them and demonstrate that our plans are actionable and that they're effective. So that's what we're going to be spending the next year or so on.
Well, Theresa, thank you so much for being on the show. A lot of great tidbits of information there. Really love that concept of transparency. I think that's huge. When you're thinking about resiliency, you've got to be incredibly transparent about where the weaknesses might be. So thank you again.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
To learn more about Theresa and her work at Capital One, click the links in the episode description. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for listening to the Employee Safety Podcast from Alert Media, the industry's most intuitive emergency communication and threat intelligence solution. To learn more about how to protect your people and business during critical events, visit alertmedia.com. Until next time.